I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over. And Rumaan Alam actually is the one who turned me on to Helen Garner's novels. And I'm really excited to say Pantheon is republishing a couple of the early novels and a nonfiction book. We're going to talk about one of the novels and the nonfiction in this conversation. But Helen, it's such a treat to finally meet you. I mean, Rumaan has been talking about you for a really long time. And I even bought a used copy of the children's Bach before I got the new one from Pantheon. So I just want to say I have both now. Booksellers, we have multiple copies of things, but it's really nice to see you. Thank you so much for making the time. So I have a question for you, though, before we really get going. You're on the road in the United States, and is this the first time you've done like a really big tour?
I've never. I'm exhausted, to tell you that. It's such a huge flight to get here, like 25 hours.
It is,
and it takes days to get over. But I'm having a wonderful time. People are so kind to me, and I'm enjoying it very much.
I'm really happy to hear that. When Rumaan told me about the children's Bach, and he did that thing that he does also in the introduction to the children's Bach, where he says, I'm not going to tell you what it's about. I'm just going to say you need to read this book. And I listen to Rumaan when it comes to things like this. And I have to say, as I was reading this tiny, thin novel, it's very tautly written.
It's small, isn't it?
It's really great. It's so satisfying. It's the early 80s. We're in Australia, but we could be anywhere. Married couple, 2 young children, college friend of the husband shows up with her younger sister in tow. And then we also meet her sort of paramour, who's, well, he's Philip. So we've got Dexter, Athena, the 2 boys, Elizabeth, Vicky, Philip, and then he has an adolescent daughter, Poppy, who is really kind of not having it with anyone. It's a really tight cast. Things happen. I would like to not spoil the things for people who have not yet read this book, because you do a lot of very cool stuff in this book. But it made me think of Paula Fox and Desperate Characters. As I was reading, I was like, oh, okay. I see sort of the marriage malaise. I mean, I think we're not really giving anything away there, but the marriage malaise and the way you're sort of talking about how Dexter sees the world and how Athena sees the world and Elizabeth and Phil, all of the adults are a little akimbo in their way of seeing things. But with the children's Bach, you wrote it in the early 80s, correct?
It came out in, 84, I think. Okay. So I wrote it in the early 80s, yeah.
So you'd been working as a freelance journalist at that point. Monkey's Grip had come out in 77, so you'd had a novel behind you. Mm. And then my understanding is there was a novel in between that you were kind of like, well, it didn't really work, but it taught me how to write children's Bach.
Yeah, I published Monkey Grip, and then I went to France I was away for about 18 months, and I never thrived outside of Australia, I have to say. But anyway, while I was there, I thought, wow, Monkey Grip, that's been quite successful. I'll just do, more of the same. And you can't do that. That's how I learned that you can't do that. I cobbled together what I thought was a novel, and I showed it to my publisher, and they said, Helen, this is terrible. It's really bad. So, I mean, they really hit me with it, and I sort of cringed away, and I thought, well, there's some stuff in it that seems quite good. So I broke it into pieces and kept 2 stories and just chucked away the rest. And it's not really the high point of my life's experience. The thing I learned was you can't write the same book twice.
Right.
So that's a good thing to learn, because you can waste a lot of time trying to follow something that's worked and it's not going to work again. So I messed around with that for, I don't know, a year or so, and came out and nobody liked it much correctly. And then, I don't know, something happened. Then I wrote this one, The Children's Bach, and I'm always saying this to people that I sort of can't believe that I wrote it. I just don't know. I mean, I look at it now and I see it shows certain skills and competence, and I don't know where I got them from, because I certainly didn't have them when I was writing Monkey Grip. Yeah, it was quite a strange experience, and it's short, and as you say, it's kind of compact.
It flies. The book really flies.
I think it's only about 35,000 words, maybe 37,000. It's very short. But it's got some kind of, it's sort of substantial. I look at it in amazement. Mm-hmm. I think, how the hell did I write that book? It's the only real novel that I've written, that hangs together like a novel, and, it looks like a novel and it smells like a novel, and it is a novel.
Okay. I mean, having read Monkey Grip, I can say Monkey Grip, I should also mention for people who haven't read it yet. I mean, do we want to call it autofiction? I mean, it's very
Yeah,
closely pulled from your own
people
life.
can call it
Okay.
whatever they like. You know, I went around for years defensively saying, "How dare you suggest I just publish my diary?" But you know, it's based on a lot of experiences that I had. Yeah, and you know, I don't mind saying that. So it's loose. It's very loose textured.
Loose textured, but your prose in the children's Bach is much more mature.
Yeah.
And I was going to describe it as looser than what I read in Monkey Grip, because I felt like you were more confident telling these stories and letting your characters collide and letting things go where they were. Because again, I didn't feel like I needed to know that I was in a suburb of Melbourne in 1984 or so.
Oh, thanks. I'm glad you thought
I liked the sort of universality of it. I mean, it could have been, you know, Westchester County, New York. It could have been Marin County, California. It just had this sort of timelessness and familiarity in a good way. I was just like, okay.
Oh, thanks. That makes me happy to hear that. Thank you.
Oh, I'm glad to know that. But you know, Dexter's sort of figuring out where he is. He's a little stodgy. He's a little set in his ways. He's kind of very old for a young man. His wife has always been married. They do have some stress. One of their children, he doesn't have a diagnosis in the book, but it sounds like he has some sort of delay.
I think just to be blunt about it, I think he's autistic.
Okay.
Because back at the time when I wrote that book, the word autism wasn't in current use. Nobody knew what to call these children who were profoundly not cutting it, you know, in their developmental stages. But it didn't occur to me to name his condition because I didn't know what it was. I didn't know it had a name.
But I do think it gives readers space to sort of interpret where Dexter and Athena are.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's sort of hinted that Dexter had a crush on Elizabeth, this former classmate, and she sort of pops up. It's very nicely done, the way you have them meeting at the airport. There were reviews that I saw where people had said, oh, well, look at all of this domestic drama that she's writing about. And yet anyone who reads the children's Bach knows there's a lot of social commentary in this book, and there's a lot of political commentary in this book. And it's delightful. It's really, I mean, any book that thinks marriage is maybe not the answer for everyone is pretty okay in my book, because we should have options. We should have options about this marriage thing. But when you sat down to write the children's Bach, of course, you have all of this past experience publishing, but in terms of the story and in terms of these characters, how did this book start for you?
I had an old friend who was in a very solid marriage, and they had a child who had the sort of symptoms and disorders that this little boy, Billy, has in the book. I was terribly moved by the spectacle of a family that's had this trouble sort of sold out to them, and a deep trouble, and a child that obviously isn't going to grow up in a normal way. And I was moved by their resolution to incorporate the child into their lives in a, you know, the best, warmest way they could. And I don't know, I just thought, I wonder, that's a very strong family unit. I thought, I wonder what would happen if somebody from the other sort of world that I know sort of crashed into that little world, what would happen? There's this character called Philip who recurs lots of times in my work, and he's a kind of an archetypal figure. He's not based on one person, but he's one of those guys who a really kind of sexy rock and roll sort of guy with a rather loose moral fibre, and terribly charming and good looking and funny, and everyone immediately adores him. Not someone you could ever depend upon.
Right.
Well, he's the sort of guy who would crash in and out of your life, and it would be a lot of fun, but it would end poorly. And so I just wonder if a guy like that turns up, what would happen to a family unit that was so bound by both love and duty to the child. So I just chucked them all together and tried to see what happened.
There were a couple of things I thought I saw coming that didn't happen, and then a couple of things that I was like, oh, yeah. I mean, it is really just emotionally satisfying. I believed that these people would make these decisions and do these things as they played out. And you don't waste words when you're doing it. There is not an extra comma. There's not an extra adjective. It's really spare. You've kept diaries for a really long time, right? I know some were sort of famously burned before you went to school, and those are not the ones I'm talking about. But does giving yourself the freedom to keep a diary like that, does that influence and I'm not talking about the subject matter. I'm not talking about taking notes from your own life. I'm literally talking about the physical craft of story and sort of identifying, the pinch points, the before and after, the moments that you get in a story that make it interesting. Like, is that part of it for you?
Oh, look, writing a diary that's how I learned to write.
Okay.
Years of practice. I still keep one and I write on it every day, in the morning and in the evening, usually twice. And it's a great pleasure to me. I mean, people talk about journaling, and I often think, I don't know what they mean by that. I think that to me, a diary is a lifelong form of practice. And you might be just writing about otherwise boring daily domestic events or things you saw in the street. But the thing about writing a diary, if you enjoy writing, that's where you sort of use your kind of linguistic skills and you've got raw material. There's endless amounts of that to use. And you can try writing something this way, or you can try writing it that way. And so you do a lot of observation because you want to have something to say at the end of the day or something to record. And writing a diary is, for me anyway, a great freedom. I like my diary writing. I like it better than anything else I do because it's free. It's not for a deadline. I'm just doing it purely for pleasure and just for the pleasure of pushing a pen across the page. And all those years of observation. Yeah, that's another thing, especially in this book. There's a couple of scenes in this book that are composed almost entirely of things out of my notebook, which I used to. I still have a notebook. I don't use it so much anymore, but I never went anywhere without a notebook and a pen. I often write down the way people speak. I just hear somebody's turn of phrase, and it's not what they're saying so much as just the way they put words together or their sort of little trumpeting piece of rhetoric and in daily life. And I make a note of lots of those. And they really come in handy when you're writing a novel. You've got this storehouse of detail that you've been collecting for years, and it gives up its treasures at the moment when you need to open it up.
That's such a great image. But you also kept a separate diary for the book that ultimately became House of Grief, which is the nonfiction. Some might call it true crime. I think it's a little more complicated than that. It's not just the recounting of a crime and a trial.
I wouldn't call it true crime.
Yeah, there's so much happening in this book. And both the case and the retrial happened over 7 years. You're in the courtroom the whole time. I knew nothing about this case until I read this House of Grief. So would you give listeners a quick synopsis? This is a shocking case, honestly. It's the best way to describe it. A shocking case that happened in Australia.
Yeah, I can briefly sum it up. A man and his wife lived in a small town in the country outside Melbourne. They had 3 little boys. And he was just an ordinary working guy. Worked, I think at that point he was a window cleaner. They were trying to build themselves a bigger house. And they hired this guy to pour a concrete slab for their new house. And the wife took up with this guy, or took a fancy to him. And she basically decided she didn't want the marriage to go on, so she terminated it and said to her husband, I want you to move out. You can see the kids anytime you like, and all I want is the better of the 2 cars. They had 2 cars. Pretty soon, she's to be seen going around with the new guy who's driving the better of the 2 cars that came from the couple. So I'm not sure how much time passed, but it was Father's Day, and on Father's Day, he took, the man's name is Robert Farquharson, he took his kids out for the day to the nearby town. And on the way back, after dark, he was bringing them home to their mother. They drove along a certain stretch of road beside which there was a very, very deep hole filled with rainwater. It was filled to the brim. And as his car came down a hill, it swerved across oncoming traffic, through the fence, and it went first into this dam, and it sank to the bottom. He got out and managed to escape the car, but the car with the children in it went to the bottom. and they were drowned.
And they were little.
They were little. The littlest one was only 2.
Right.
And the others were, like going upwards from there.
Right.
3 of them. And he hitched a ride back to town, and there were two guys picked him up, 2 young guys, and he was all dripping and covered with slime because he'd been in this water, and they said, "What's the matter?" He said, "Oh, I've put my car into the dam and my kids are in it. Take me to my wife." And they say, "What, are you crazy? Let's get into the water and try and get the kids out." He said, "No, it's too late. Take me back to town." So those 2 poor guys, who will probably never get over this, took him back to town to his wife, and everything developed from there. And he wasn't charged until about 3 months later. It was obviously going to be a difficult case to prove. And so the hearings, there was a trial. He was found guilty. He appealed. He was had a second trial, was found guilty again. Then he tried to appeal again, tried to go to the High Court. They wouldn't hear it. So now, and he got 33 years and he's in jail now. There is one very crucial factor in the trials. During the first trial, his wife believed in him. His wife swore black and blue that he would not have killed the boys, that he loved the boys. And then by the time the second trial comes up, she swung around and she changes her mind. And now she's a raging figure. She says, "Now I believe that he did do it on purpose." And so she was sort of terrifying as a witness. She was filled with such shocking rage and grief, and it was very hard to see what she suffered in court and what he suffered. It was an enormously painful story, but very, very moving.
It's interesting to me, too, as I was reading, how you were struggling with the information that was not just being presented in court, but you were watching the jurors. You were certainly watching, family members in the venue. And you're interacting with people. I mean, this was a very big case in Australia. And so you'd be out on the street or you'd be with friends, and this is the kind of thing that everyone has an opinion about.
Yes.
And you found yourself occasionally puzzling through how you felt about things, or also feeling like you needed to defend someone, whether it could be anyone. I mean, there were times where you felt like a witness had been treated, not well, or had not comported themselves well. So, I mean, you were watching every single detail.
Yeah.
For 7 years.
Yeah.
That's a really long time. It's a really long time.
Bear in mind that there would be the 7 years, there would be one hearing per year.
Right.
A couple of months each year. But I couldn't write the thing, of course, until it was over. And so I thought, my God, this is never going to end. And I'll be stuck in this story for the rest of my life. It was very grueling. I desperately wanted him not to be guilty.
Okay.
Because it's just unbearable to me to think that someone would kill his children. It was suggested in one of the very latest of the hearings that it might have been a failed suicide attempt. That did not come up until right near the very end, when he was trying to go to the High Court. And he was enraged that his counsel put that forward. He sat there shaking his head. He did not want people to connect him with the idea of suicide. And it interested me greatly that it didn't come up until right near the end, when they were desperate. I tried hard, and this is what I want the reader to do in this book, is to come with me into the court and look at the people as I did, and get, if I can convey to them the effect that looking at those people had on me about whether he was guilty or not, or just the kind of swinging this way and that happens in a long trial, which is I think would be very hard to convey if I'd written it with a sort of a God's eye third person account, which it never had occurred to me. I suppose I should do that, because that's the one classic way that people tell these stories. But I just wanted people to come in there with me and look at it with me and kind of feel it with me. I think that's kind of worked in the book, judging by what people have said to me about it.
I was really sort of charting my response as I was reading it, because, again, I didn't know anything about this case until I started reading the book. I had read The Spare Room, which was another one of your novels that was published in the States, and I'd read the children's book. I had not yet read Monkey Grip. There are a couple of things that carry through your work, regardless of, whether we call it fiction or nonfiction or reportage or what have you. You are so remarkably honest. And you don't let your characters get away with anything. But you leave some things in House of Grief that some other writers might have taken out or kept to themselves or only shared over the dinner table. And I thought that was really an interesting way of staying in the story, but not taking it over. It never, ever became about you. I mean, you quote Janet Malcolm a couple of times in the book too, and it's clear that she's a massive, and it's been a minute since I've read The Journalist and the Murderer, but I've read it a couple of times. And so seeing sort of her influence on you and watching you sort of take a step back and say, well, at one point you felt like you had to defend him to a friend who was like, well, you're just making excuses. And you're like, well, actually, the dude has had kind of a terrible life. And he's not a monster. And yet people are saying, well, he's a monster. Mm. And you just come back and say, well, it's because our brains can't process what he's done.
Yes, I think that's true. I think some people feel angered by the book. How dare you poke your nose into other people's business in this intimate way? Or actually, not many people said that, not reviewers, but people who called into radio programs. I was on things like that. At least one person said, I'm not going to read this book because I know that nowhere in this book does she say that he's a monster. And it's true, I don't say he's a monster because I don't think he's a monster. I think he's a person who, and this is why, if he were a monster, I wouldn't be interested in writing about him. What I'm interested in is people who seem to be quite ordinary, and they're not, psychopaths, and they're not the murdering type, whatever that is. But the events of their lives push them past the thing in themselves that enables the rest of us to endure our bad fortune, and they push through that, or their foot goes through the floor in a moment of crazy feeling, and they do something irreparable that can never be mended. And that's what you see when you go into a court and look at the person in the dock. You see an accused person. You see somebody who is broken, not someone who's defiantly sitting there saying, well, she deserved it. It's not like that. It's a person who's done the worst thing that you can think of. And I mean, who knows what you feel like the next day when you've done something as terrible as that. You've broken through that thing that most of us remain contained in. I don't know what it is, but some ability to endure pain without destroying everything around them.
Watching you wrestle with sort of what's vengeance, what's justice, what does fear make people do? I mean, this guy was wildly isolated after his marriage breaks up. It sounds like he was a little isolated and lonely in the marriage too, honestly. And again, none of us is making excuses. I wouldn't define him as a monster. I would define his behavior as being monstrous. Yes.
He committed a monstrous deed, but I don't think he's a monster.
But I think there are also levels of, we tend to like grab words really quickly and just slap a label on because it's shorthand. And watching people wrestle with language throughout this House of Grief was wild because, again, I had moments where I was like, ugh, this guy, he absolutely, without a doubt, he did this. This is gross. Like, he is Kali, destroyer of worlds, right? And then I had moments where I thought, well, maybe. And then no, I kept coming back to the fact I really couldn't get beyond the fact that he had done something terrible. And then there were all of these sort of weird moments around it. And I'm not going to spoil the plot points, but I had a very emotional response to a thing that I knew nothing about, I think is what I'm trying to get to. It was interesting. It was really interesting for me reading the book and going, I have a lot of feelings about this. And I know nothing about these people or this case or anything beyond what you're telling me on the page.
The people that are in the story are the kind of people that we know. It's not as if they're sort of weird tribe on the outskirts of civilization. They're people who go to the supermarket, or they try to build a house, or they pour a concrete slab and put the new house on it, or they go to the supermarket with the children and get an ice cream. I mean, it's the awfulness that one of the questions that I tried to think about was people kept saying in his defense, but he loved those boys. I thought about that a lot. And I thought, when you love somebody, it goes right into the very darkest part of you, into the depths of you that you don't understand. And there are these drives that are in there in the dark. And love and disappointed love, rejection in love, it drives people round the twist. I think to say that because you love someone means you wouldn't want to kill them seems to me, I mean, in my experience, I've wanted to kill people I've loved quite a lot. And by some good fortune, I've never done it.
Mm-hmm.
But I've never picked up a weapon or, got that close. But what comes out of you under the power of love it doesn't, I mean, romantic love just doesn't kind of touch the sides here. This is love of deep, brutal, dark love, dependency, things that when they're violated, you can't answer for what might happen. And I think that's kind of stuff Freud talks about, and I've found that really useful.
That was one of the things I definitely sort of, every time someone either on Farquharson's Family or, your reporting turned up moments where people would say, oh, no, he loved me. People justify a lot of things with love. So that argument just has never carried weight with me. No, it just absolutely never has.
It does not hold water.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was wild to me how heavily people leaned on that from multiple points of view. It wasn't just, and I kept thinking, wait, step back for 2 seconds, really step back for 2 seconds. That is an extraordinary thing to say, that, children were murdered at the hands of a parent who loved them unconditionally. It's like, well, actually.
Yeah, well, that's hard for us to bear. I mean, these are realizations, aren't they, about humans and what we're like and what we're capable of, and how it seems to me that there's this darkness exists in all of us.
Yeah.
And many of us, it doesn't come out. Or what life hands us doesn't cause all our systems to kind of break down.
Right.
But there are some people who suffer in ways that make them commit appalling crimes. And they have to go to jail. I mean, you can't have people like that walking around the street.
Yeah.
Don't let me get started on that.
In this particular case, too, I mean, and you've talked about this in other interviews about your work in general, but knowing that the family is sort of the place where everything starts.
Yeah.
Right. So, I want to come back to this, and I know I mentioned it earlier in the show, but this idea that somehow if you're writing about a domestic scene, it can't be epic and it can't be ambitious. And it's just like, well, here's a pile of dirty dishes. And, we're just going to, follow along as someone quietly has a nervous breakdown, when in fact, actually, it is kind of the story of the world, right? Like it just happens that we're in a kitchen and there's this idea that women only write these tiny, tiny books.
I know, that's what people said to me for ages. With a small canvas, they used to say, your book's a small canvas. When you were talking just now, I suddenly remembered a scene in a fantastic British TV movie I saw recently. I think it was called Marriage. Anyway, it was the actress Nicola Walker, and her father was dependent on her in an enraging way. And there's a scene in it which was like in real time, where you see him standing by the fridge, demandingly waiting for her to make him a sandwich. The film follows the making of the sandwich, every detail. She goes to the fridge, gets the stuff, gets the bread out of the packets, all in one big shot, makes the sandwich. And the whole time she's making the sandwich, you're thinking, she's almost screaming with repressed rage.
Right.
And it goes into, and she doesn't make it brutally, but something about the making of the sandwich, it's almost like it's a poisoned sandwich. But it's the most astonishing scene. I watched it with my mouth hanging open. I thought, my God, look what they're doing. They're doing this in real time and it's unbearable.
I mean, again, this idea that, a guy like Farquharson just suddenly emerges out of nowhere. And I'm not saying that his family is necessarily responsible. I'm simply saying that we can't ignore that he came from some place. He came from something, he didn't just walk out of the woods and suddenly be a person. This is not, And if we're not looking at these pieces, right, and the jurors, they all have families, the judges, the lawyers, you have family. Like the idea that somehow this person can act independently of everything in the world around him. It's a little bit of a fairy tale to say that there isn't, all of these different pieces, it's ultimately the end of his family unit as he knows it, the wife and the three boys, that makes him do something unspeakable.
Well, there is a theme that runs through the book. When I say a theme, a series of events. That after the marriage breakup, he goes to see a therapist. I mean, under pressure because, he's a country bloke in Australia and they're the hardest people in the world to get to go and talk to someone. And that man gave evidence in court. And he spoke about how Farquharson behaved and the sort of things that they said to each other. And I was sort of stunned by the shallowness of the conversations that he reported. Okay, so he's just a psychologist in the bush.
Right.
And he, a person of goodwill. And somehow nobody perceived the depth to which Robert Farquharson was feeling this breakdown. He kept saying, oh, yeah, no, it doesn't. No, I'm okay. Nobody seemed to be aware that he was building up this terrible head of steam. It didn't occur to anybody. Well, it wouldn't, I suppose. And yet people suffer so much in their family torments. I just kept thinking, why couldn't this guy have used his imagination a bit more while dealing with this sad guy? They were always asking, and people were always saying to him, are you taking your medication? Are you taking your medication? That's one thing that happened, that some tapes were played in the court. They bugged his phone because it was such a strange case. They had to try to get evidence from what he was saying to other people. And again you'd hear that, and you'd hear there was a friend or a relative would ring up and see how he was. And they'd always start by saying, are you taking your medication? That would be the first question they asked him. People cling to that idea of medicating our pain.
There's an idea of masculinity that goes certainly with an Australian stereotype to a certain extent. And if you're caught up in that, and if you're defining yourself in those terms, right, not even necessarily consciously defining yourself in those terms, and yet, your wife throws you out, and what does that mean for you as a man, right? Many men are not great about talking about their feelings anyway. So you're talking about this doctor, and I'm like, I can imagine these two dudes sitting in a room, not really having a good go of it, trying to get each other to talk.
Yeah.
And I realize it's the doctor's job. But at the same time, like, how do you get someone to talk who doesn't want to talk? Or doesn't think there's a problem, or doesn't think he's the problem? You can sort of see the circles that people are driving themselves in.
That part of the story was very painful to me. I felt so sad for everybody. It's a terribly painful story. As you say, he was lonely. There were so many details in the story where his loneliness is clear. His loneliness between when his wife broke up the marriage and when he drove into the dam. There were all these hints given that he was actually thinking of driving into a truck. He actually told one of his friends that. And his friends said, oh, bullshit, mate, you don't do something like that. That people don't dare to go into each other's darkness.
You've told other people, too, that by the time everything was over, as you said, you needed to wait until all of the appeals played out and everything. You needed as much of the material before you could sit down to write. And certainly if you're writing something as a trial is going on, it becomes a very different book. But you've also described yourself as being traumatized at the end of it, as you sat down to write. And I'm wondering if you would be willing to talk about that a little bit. We've hinted at some of the material. It is very dark material, but it wasn't just the material that you were having a response to.
Well, you see, all throughout the trial, I would write something every day after the hearing, each hearing. So I had a lot of material to work with by the time I got to the end and had to start writing. But I live with right next door to my daughter and her family.
Right.
And her husband and their 3 kids. And the kids were quite small at the time. There were 2 of them who were little boys, and, they were at the age where they liked to come sit on my knee. And I'd get home from the court sort of stark with horror at what I'd been listening to, and they'd run to me and want to cuddle me and sit on the couch and sit on my knee. And they were 2 of them were the age of two of the dead boys, and I sort of felt that I would contaminate them. It was
Right.
a weird kind of superstitious feeling, as if the horror of the court would kind of stick to me on the way home, and it'd come off on them. And it didn't. I mean, obviously it didn't, but that's what I mean by traumatised, that you carry that a story like that around. And I sit with the journalists sometimes, and I admire the journalists. They've got a kind of toughness that I hadn't got, because I'm not, I'm never trained. I've never been in a newsroom. I've never been a real journalist. I didn't have to come up with anything written. I mean, they had to go away at the end of each day and file some copy, but I just could hang on for 7 years and the whole thing festering away. At the end, I ran into one of those journalists whom I hadn't seen since the trial. And some years later, I ran into him and I thought, oh, there's Phil. And I just went to say hello, and he waved. And I thought that would be the end of it, but he came running towards me and he plonked down in the seat next to me and said, how did you pull up after the Farquharson trial? And I suddenly thought, oh, God, this is like 2 years later. And I thought, oh, I don't think I pulled up all that well. It was when he asked me the question that I started thinking about it. And I said, oh, no, not so good. How about you? And he just blurted out that he'd had a kind of crack up and had to leave his job. And
Wow.
So it was when he kind of admitted that to me, or told it to me, that I realised that we were all freaked out by it, by just the horror of the story and the pain. So it was a relief to me that he said that, and I probably would never have even confessed it to myself if he hadn't told me that that's what he was feeling.
That's really interesting to hear you say you might not have thought about it if someone hadn't asked you, because, I mean, having read the book, it's clear you're struggling. It's clear that you are wrestling with things where you're like, I can't even believe and this is the thing that I do appreciate you as the narrator of this book, where you're saying, I can't even believe I'm thinking about this. I can't even believe that I'm worried about X, Y, or Z. And again, I'm just staying away from spoilers. But there were some moments where my eyes got really big.
Yeah.
I was like, oh, she left that in. Okay. I'm not sure I would have been as generous. I don't know if that's because I was raised in Boston. We tend to stand on hills and smite people. That's what we do for fun. I get a little judgy about people who make bad decisions. And I'm not making light of this story at all. It's just I'm making light of myself as a reader. And because you put your work out into the world, and reader brings half of the book, with whatever their experience is. So watching you be willing to play this out on the page it was fascinating. It was really fascinating and a really sort of satisfying reading experience for me. And again, it's not a case I knew anything about. I know very little about the Australian court system, but I recognize the characters. I recognize you as a narrator. I recognize the families, the members of the families, the various people who roll through this book, the same way that I can recognize the characters in the children's Bach and Monkey Grip. I recognize them for being their own people and having their own impressions of the world and making their own decisions. And you do it with dialogue, and you do it with these details. You just get these details that go from being very specific to wildly universal in the span of very few words.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. I want to write in such a way that there's room for the reader to come in.
Yeah.
That's partly why I try and have do it in as few words as possible. I don't want to have great passages with lots of flourishes and opinions. I just want to make room for the reader to come in and feel things on their own account. So I'm glad that the characters work like that. I suppose they are pretty sort of archetypal, aren't they? I mean, when you're talking about a family, you've got a lot of archetypes moving around there.
Archetypal, yes, but more just fully human to me. I will say this to you. The ending felt inevitable to me, and it still felt slightly surprising, even though, because it was maybe just me thinking, and actually when we turn off the recording, I am going to tell you exactly what I'm referring to.
Okay.
I was sad. I was sad at that person's decision. I was like, oh, okay.
No one could say it had a happy ending. I mean, I don't see it as a happy ending. I see it as a resolution But an older writer, a woman who I admired and liked very much, Jessica Anderson.
Yeah.
She said to me just casually one day that she thought that it was a conservative book. She said women tend to write a conservative book when their daughter is a teenager. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. But I went and kind of checked if other people had done it.
Huh.
But it was an interesting remark.
It is an interesting remark. We are going to let that hang in the air, though, so people can think about it and then go read the children's Bach. I don't need happy endings. It did feel like a resolution, but it also felt very true to the characters and the story and what they were wrestling with. It was a good experience for me as a reader to have these books in tandem. I think some folks may gravitate towards one or the other simply because they say, well, I read nonfiction, I read fiction. I am hoping people come to both. I do think you can see a through line of you. Character is everything for you, I feel. I mean, it's sort of like you love lovely sentences too, but you need the character to sort of grab onto, and then the lovely sentences come. Whereas some writers are just like, no, I need the lovely sentences first, and then we can figure out the rest of it. And I think you need the people first, whether they're sitting in front of you or you're sort of conjuring them. Well, fingers crossed that we get people to pick them both up, because I think as a pair, I think they work.
Yeah, I'm really very pleasantly surprised to see that they do work as a pair. I wouldn't have got my mind that they would have. So this has been very interesting for me. Thank you.
Good. I'm glad to hear it. Helen Garner, thank you so much for joining us on Poured Over. Both the children's Bach and His House of Grief are out now, and Monkey Grip comes in early 2024. And they have a really fantastic sort of look across the three of them. I'm so pleased. Anyway, thank you again. This was great.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.